So now we're going to do our second roundtable, and our focus is going to be on depots and the selection of them, and some hopefully a lot of stories around lessons learned. The idea of BSMA is that you come and you learn a lot from folks, and you're free to ask questions. So I think I'm going to try to move through a number of pieces just a little bit faster, and hopefully we can get to a few minutes of your questions, because I think there's some good practical stuff here. So I'm going to, in an effort to speed things up, I'm going to do the introductions. So first off, we have Scott Bailey. There you go. Yep, good.
Wait a minute. First, wouldn't you go? First off is the person closest to you.
So Scott's a senior director. That's awesome. Scott's a senior director of clinical supply chain for Americas and Europe at BeiGene. BeiGene is a headquarterless global company with 7,000 employees in the U.S., China, Europe, and Australia, focused on making cutting-edge, life-saving medicine accessible to billions more people around the world. Prior to joining the industry, Scott earned a BS at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He was a captain in the Air Force, where he flew planes and worked as an intelligence officer. Thanks for being with us, Scott. Next, we have Emily Callumquim.
Hello, Emily.
Emily's a manager of clinical supply chain team at BioMarin. BioMarin is a global technology or biotechnology company headquartered in San Rafael, California. Its core business, research focused on enzyme replacement gene therapies for rare diseases. Emily's been part of the clinical supply chain team at BioMarin since 2014, which includes successfully managing BioMarin's first worldwide phase 3 gene therapy clinical trial, in addition to developing an end-to-end clinical supply chain inventory management tool. And I'm going to give your intro here, Bill, and I don't even have notes. So
man needs no introduction.
We're going to be good enough. So Bill's kind enough to be sitting in, and I think we'll get, from all of his industry experience, we're going to get a lot of his perspective. Probably on a lot of times when I ask the questions to Scott and Emily, we'll have Bill mostly chime in from his own experience. So, So I want to just start off with a background question. I think one of the best things we can do here is just sort of disseminate some of the experiences and knowledge here. Emily, we'll start with you, and this is just to sort of paint the overall picture. But can you describe your company's overall clinical depot setup and any other key information that would be relevant for the group to then understand, a little bit of where you're coming from or what your experience has been?
Sure, thanks, Dan. So at BioMarin, most of our business is in contract with a third-party vendor, and they do all of our distribution to our clinical sites. Currently, however, one of our clinical programs, which is in gene therapy, we're starting to do internal distribution. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of turns out, because now that means more liability for us to make sure that our products are getting to the patient and we're not relying on a third party to manage it for us.
Okay, Scott, same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just add onto my bio, we were making it shorter, but after the Air Force, I've been working in the industry for 14 years. So I worked for Genentech for a lot of that, and now I've been working with BeiGene for about 3 years. And BeiGene's been growing extremely rapidly. So when I started, that same year, it had gone from 200 employees to 2,000 employees, and since then we now have 7,000 employees. We're running over 100 clinical trials all over the world, and we got commercial approvals for 2 different drugs on 4 different continents so far. So things are moving very quickly at BeiGene. And when I was at the Air Force Academy, Donald Rumsfeld came and spoke at our graduation. Donald Rumsfeld.
That's cool.
So I'm very familiar, with the unknowns. He talked about the unknowns, right? The unknown unknowns. And I think at BeiGene we run into those a lot, because our business model is a little bit different in that we go to a lot of the less represented regions of the world, kind of some of the more underserved patient populations. And so our depots, we have also a lot of contract manufacturers that we work with, but we have 5 CMOs actually that we work with for distribution. 2 of them are the big kind of global presence ones. And then because we go to some other markets that aren't as typical, we also have 3 other CMOs we work with that have regional expertise that for one reason or another, either cost or regional knowledge, we find that they can provide a little bit better service in some regions of the world. And speed's very important to our company. I think, try to look for whatever setup is going to lead to the least disruption, of the clinical trial. So we have regional depots that we've set up. Our main regional depots are in Germany for the most part, for the EU. But we also have depots in Switzerland to serve Eastern Europe, as well as now the UK and Switzerland, so sort of non-EU. And we found that that's pretty important to try to separate those if possible, to not do value-add steps that require QP if it's not going to an EU country and not coming from an EU country. We've run into situations where we've been really held up and we're like, well, we didn't manufacture this in the EU and it's not going to the EU, but we put a label on it in the EU, and then there's a big long delay. So we have both out of Switzerland and out of Germany for Europe. And then we also have a regional depot that we set up. In the APAC region, we have 3 regional depots, 1 in Singapore, 2 in China, and then we have 1 in Australia as well. And then in the US, we have a couple of depots in the US as well. And then as far as the rest of the structure, we have 11 local depots, and we can get into that a little bit more, why some of those are required. But we have local depots in Belarus and Ukraine and Georgia and Russia, and then also in South Africa. We have in the Americas, we have local depots in Brazil and Mexico, and in APAC we have local depots in Taiwan and Japan. I think that about wraps it up. So we have about 16 local depots, 5 regional depots, and I can get into a little later as well why we go and why we think it's worth to go to some markets that maybe don't have as much infrastructure in place already, but it's important to build.
That's great. Bill, I just wanted to, the question was really, how are you setting up your depots? What's your company's profile? In your own experience, because I know you've done some work, not only with your direct career really at BioMarin and prior, but as you hear from other companies and how they're setting up their depots, what are some of your sort of takeaways for overall how companies can sort of look at their depot, I'll call it maybe their depot strategy for how they set things up?
I think that, when the first time I was tasked with the responsibility of determining, where do I need to set up a depot and how, the first thing I thought of is, what problems did I inherit in other places that I worked where, for whatever reason, it felt like something was broken. And what first comes to mind is I remember, being in supply chain and people saying, where is your drug that was supposed to go to Brazil or to Australia or to Ukraine or whatever the case may be? And I felt like I couldn't answer the question. Why? Because I didn't know where the drug was. I had no visibility to it. And then just sort of peeling back that question to try to figure out why can't I figure it out and how can I fix the problem. And what I learned from that is, in that particular example, it was because the CRO picked the freight forwarder, and therefore, when it left the distributor that I had visibility to, and it's one of the big three, it went from that distributor, which is either shipping it from Pennsylvania or Ireland or England, if you will. So you know the three I'm talking about. And it landed in this black hole because it was stuck in customs and being managed by a freight forwarder that we had no visibility to. Why? Because I'm supply chain and I'm not ClinOps, and we don't talk to the CRO when we're in supply chain. That's just the way it was, and I don't know if that's normal, but that's how it was with us. So basically I said, well, the first thing I want to do is I want to find a solution that has an end-to-end real-time visibility to where the drug is. And that's what sort of drove the strategy to determine where to pick the depots and how and who. Is I wanted to start with a company that could provide us visibility in their system, not just from where it was sitting before it shipped, but all the way to where the depot was going to sit. And that pretty much narrowed it down to those three companies. And I was able to convince Clinical Ops to say that make that supply chain's job, not the CRO's job, to identify the whole end-to-end supply chain. Who's the depot? Who's the freight forwarder? What's the system that gives us the visibility to it? And then it just became a matter of interviewing those three companies to say which ones have a presence in the countries that we need to ship. What tool or system do they have? Does it give us real-time visibility? How much experience do you have in those countries that we need to ship to? What is your quality systems there? Have they been audited and approved by the FDA or other regulatory bodies that would satisfy our own quality group? You know, obviously, what's it going to cost? What's your temperature capabilities? Can you store our unique minus 55C system? And if not, what's it going to cost for us to buy a freezer? And what's the lead time for that? So it's on and on and on. So it's not a simple answer, but as I said, it all came down to wanting to get my hand on the inventory and say, I want to be able to know where it is every step of the way, and from there, the dominoes will fall.
Thanks, Bill. I can sort of explain maybe an interesting story. I worked with a company that was actually based in Massachusetts, and the head of clinical supplies talked about a very formal process he had where every 3 years he would go out and have like the major CMO contract. And a very interesting thing happened. The one that would win the contract typically came in last the next time there was some evaluation. I don't understand, maybe once you win the work, maybe there wasn't as much of a focus. So he had a lot of turnover on who his major CMO was going to be. And it was actually a very long 6-month effort to go ahead and put out the RFP to rebid the work. So that was one strategy on how to maybe have a CMO partnership, and then also maybe also what are some of the factors for the selection when you have choices during a study. So I think Bill touched on it a bit, but Scott, maybe if you have a perspective on how you would choose to either partner or make some selections between different companies for handling your depots, that would be great to have that, and then we'll have Emily chime in.
Yeah, for sure. So, as I mentioned, we work with 5 different CMOs. It does require a little bit more management in terms of having more business review meetings, and we thought about, should we consolidate or should we not? Having said that, there's several regions that we go to where the biggest CMOs don't have quite as much experience around. So there's a number of countries, there's probably 4 or 5 countries where, because of the country regulations, they can't send samples back for destruction, for example, to a regional depot. And so, we end up having to partner with somebody that's a little more experienced in that region to make sure that they manage those things for us. I think when we look at CMOs, cost is a consideration, but also, how trained are the staff? Kind of how much turnover are we seeing? I think the job market's really hot right now, and it's tough to keep, the same people on some of the accounts, and that weighs into it. But we really award study by study. We don't go through a 3-year cycle. So for a given study, we take a look at it and try to award it to one CMO or another, and then we try to make our IMPD filings a little broader so that if there's an issue, that we do have some flexibility. There's some CMOs. There's a CMO we work with that has a lot of great experience in Australia. There's one that has a lot of great experience in Southeast Asia, and there's one that has a lot of great experience in China. So, for those, depending on if it's a phase 1, a phase 2, or a phase 3, usually if it's going to be a phase 3, we don't want somebody that's so regionally focused. But you may have them, do some of the elements of the work for you.
That's an interesting answer. I'm wondering what Emily would contrast that. That's, just a very interesting approach that BeiGene has by sort of like the ultimate in selection on a per study basis versus more of a standard primary CMO. How about at BioMarin?
Right, yeah, so it is a little bit different. We only have a few CMOs that we work with, and like I said, now we're kind of pivoting to doing our own internal CMO and own internal distribution. But with our external partners, because we really only have like 2 types of products, which is enzyme replacement or gene therapy, we tend to stick with the CMO that we're already using. But that being said, what Bill was saying, what I inherited was also decisions where CMO is only going to do the manufacture, but we're still going to ship it to a different distributor. And I think that's where sometimes I'll kind of agree with Scott too. It's really about your partnership and the regulation. And I also think, Bill touched on it too, it's the influence you also have over the CRO, because I think Bill's right that they kind of have, they clearly have a stake in the game. They are your local regulatory experts. They're going to know and speak on your behalf as a sponsor to your regulatory agencies that you're trying to get approval in, and so you really do want to partner with them. And kind of going on a tangent too, but I think to Bill's story about how you couldn't see visibly who had the product in terms of chain of custody, I think it's also worthwhile to establish partnerships with those freight forwarders, with those third-party logistics, if you will. Because I think they're obviously going to be part of the success of not only physically delivering the product, but the overall success of your clinical trial.
Real good. I wanted to ask a question that maybe would be of high interest to this audience. In the past year, I'll give you a short while to think about this. Where have you had particular challenges with managing your depots or managing your CMO relationship? What's something you could share with this group that would be more or less a current challenge that you faced, very real? And then once I get that answer, I'll give you a little bit of a preview. I want to ask you, what are some of the things you're working on to improve your performance over the next couple of years? So you can kind of think a little bit about that. Emily, you kind of nodding your head, so I'm going to go to you first. Where have you experienced some challenges in this whole area, maybe over the past year? Maybe a particular story or example that would stand out.
Yeah, Latin America is a good one, especially in the gene therapy space. I think Dr. Preston, you mentioned there's a lot of regulation, right? There's especially in gene therapy where there's old GMO laws, right, that clearly pertain to crop or agriculture science, not necessarily to drug products. So the challenges that we had with Brazil was trying to understand, first of all, what are we trying to get approved? Because there's your CTA approvals, your INPDs, and then of course there's a separate GMO lane, right, where you have to get those approvals. And with that comes where you have to list who is going to be touching your product. What's the name of your depot? Do they have the right licenses to carry GMO products? How do you know this? And so one of the issues that we had was, as I said before with BioMarin, we only had one distributor. Come to find out, their third-party partner in that country straight up told us, we can't handle GMO products. You're going to have to find somebody else to receive this product and ship it to the clinical sites. So here we are scrambling because CLL is telling us this person or a bunch of people are about to enroll in the next month or two, or maybe 3 months or so. And you already know, shipping to Brazil, that's already a very long lead time. So then we're scrambling, trying to find, well, who can be our partner? We ended up going with the CRO's preferred partner. Do we really know that was a real regulation, or was that just something that they wanted because there was some kind of deal for them to partner together? We don't know. We'll never really know, right? But however, we had to go with them. We had to do a quick audit on them just to make sure that they had the capabilities and that they were a vendor that we could trust. Had to make sure they had access to dry ice. Also had to ensure, well, what freight forwarder, once the product was in the country, what were they going to use? Could they also be our IOR, our importer of record, who can speak to the product once it does reach customs? And so that was a major lessons learned for us, because now, sorry, as I said, that was in our phase 3 trial. Now that we're going into other gene therapy products and potentially in Brazil, obviously now we're saying, okay, now we know what to look for or what not to look for, and starting to question and use our CRO's knowledge on, like, do we really need this? Can we just, is it possible to direct to site, or do we really have to use a depot in order for them to receive, GMO products?
Real good. And Scott, maybe you've got a story of where you faced some challenges over the past year or a particular situation.
Yeah, I'll shotgun some. I was writing a list. So let's see. It's gonna be like. So a big challenge we had recently was in China. There was a law in the books that had been on the books for quite a few years, but it was open to interpretation, and it was around the One China policy. So we had some verbiage on our labels that said Taiwan Chinese, and all of a sudden all of our drug in China, which is a lot of our drug, we have a lot of manufacturing in Suzhou and a big plant in Guangzhou. Suddenly we couldn't export it because it should have said Chinese Taiwan instead of Taiwan Chinese for this person's interpretation. And so I think anytime you have Macau or Hong Kong or Taiwan on your label, try to avoid doing that. Just put, traditional Chinese or simplified Chinese. So that was a big lesson for us. Interestingly, also in China, I would think that the policies would be sort of this monolithic standard across the board, but depending on which free trade zone you're shipping out of and which region you're in, you actually can get some things in or out of the country in one versus another. So one thing that we do as a company is we have a list of basically what are all the sort of unks that are now knowns. Some of the other challenges that we've had, in addition to the ones that I mentioned in China, or we just had this last month notification in Japan, there's an extra release step required at the CRO that we weren't aware of, and added 10 days to the lead time. And like, okay, well now we know, but if you don't plan for that, and it's one of the first times we saw that. In Belarus, your import license has to be renewed every 6 months, and it takes 2 months to renew it. And so that's something you also have to be aware of. At that 4-month mark, you better start your application. Brazil has very lengthy, lead time that you have to account for to get things into Brazil. We've had issues where you can't export from Italy back to Germany for destruction. And then we also had recently, and I think this is important for especially companies that are newer, that don't necessarily have a lot of process in place, is that there's a lot of dollars tied up in VAT that, depending on how you've structured things, you can get a lot of it back with VAT reclamation, or you can't. And so it took us about 4 years to get $20 million back in VAT from Germany, but we were able to do it. But it was around the VAT number that they gave us. They had changed the VAT number, and we didn't know they'd changed the VAT number. And so everything that we'd been filing for reclamation was just piling up. In Australia, you can also get back reclamation, but you have to have a local address. I think that's another important thing. So those are, the multi-million-dollar decisions you need to make sure that you're accounting for. Is you're picking your depot, and are you able to track the inventory? Are you able to track the accounting? In addition to making sure that you're hitting your lead times.
That sounds like there's just some incredible headaches and firefighting you have to do
it's
with
great.
international
It's
logistics.
wonderful. It's
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
It's wonderful. And we go into a lot of we go into some markets, like we're looking at Indonesia. Indonesia has the 4th largest population in the world, and from a GDP standpoint, from a purchasing power parity, they're 7th in the world. And nobody is really doing any trials in Indonesia. And for us, it's worth it. I mean, that's a massive patient population that doesn't have, either because it's not approved or because it's not affordable, access to a lot of the medicines, and they're willing participants in trials. Now we're going to have to build some of that infrastructure ourselves, just as we have in China. But at the end of the day, it's a quote that I really like. I'm not sure who said it, but content is king, but distribution is God.
Yep.
Yeah. Which, if you look at how some of the disruptors that have been really successful in the last decade have done it, a lot of it's through distribution. It used to be distribution was just something that was a means to an end, and you had your overall strategy, and then your distribution needed to not mess that strategy up. But now, if you look at the difference between a Blockbuster versus Redbox versus a Netflix, it's the same content. It's just how are you getting it to people, or a Kmart or an Amazon. And we have access to over 2,000 hospitals in China that we've built relationships with, and a lot of these are big mega hospitals. And so we've positioned ourselves so that we can help other companies have their trials be China inclusive, and in return we get the marketing rights in China and APAC ex Japan, because historically, Big Pharma's gotten 80% of the revenue from 7 countries, and those are the ones they focus on. That's what they go after, but that's only 20% of the world population. So there's 80% of the world population, and they are eager trial participants, because if you run a trial in the U.S., you have multiple standard of care available that's cutting edge. You have 3 other companies that are going after the same indication. And in some of these other markets, they're excited to participate in your trial because it gives them an option, it gives them some hope. So anyway, I think, for us, there are headaches. There are a lot of things. We get questions from sites where, that normally you wouldn't have to deal with if you're just going to France or the US. And there's a lot of hurdles and little headaches that pop up. But at the end of the day, it's worth it. And so we've been signing a lot of big deals recently, with Novartis and with Amgen, where we help them accelerate their clinical trials by making them China inclusive. And then, in exchange, we also help boost their sales, and we have some revenue sharing in those markets. So our model's a little bit different, but I do think I'll close with content may be king, but distribution is God. So if you can build the channels to get to the patients, then I think that's the way of the future of medicine.
Thank you for that, Scott. Very good. Yeah, the panelists have probably noticed that I'm off the script. These are not the questions we rehearsed at all. No, I'm sort of coming up with new ideas as I get this awesome responsibility. So I'm going to ask one more question. We'll go through the three panelists, and then folks in the audience, come up with what your specific questions are. Let's use these folks to solve the problems that you have, or the questions that you have. So Bill, we're going to go to you first, and it's a choice question. You can either answer what would you like to see changed in how depots are managed, or CMOs, or what would you like to see? What would make a big difference? And then the alternate one that you can answer is, it'd be kind of cool to hear maybe a bold prediction about where things are going. If you can just look out 5 years, and that can be in terms of how things are done, or who new market entrants are, or what does the future hold?
So this is more, my answer is more, where does it need to go?
That's fair.
And you heard me earlier say that in a lot of situations, the CRO manages a certain piece of the supply chain, which means supply chain is not managing a piece of the supply chain. And so the first time I started to try to understand certain legs of the supply chain, I was amazed. I was talking to the folks at Unitrans beginning of the show, saying that the first time I tried to follow the product in Logan Airport in Boston, the refrigeration that they showed me for the drug was sitting in a puddle of water next to the lobsters that had ice melting next to it. And when I started looking even at some of the distributors and thinking that they were on par with, for example, some of the companies I had visited, the Fishers and VWR, who have really mature systems. The Boise Cascades for office supplies have really mature systems. I started going to the clinical supply chain, and they were not mature systems. Simple questions like, do you have a policy that says everything that hits your loading dock today has to be put away and updated in your system by X number of hours that day? They didn't know what I was talking about. So as an industry, the clinical is so far behind where it needs to be that my prediction is supply chain needs to force a change, and it needs to start by making sure that those who know what they know and not those who don't know what they know make that change. That unfortunately, you heard me say that 90% of the biotech companies have to contract out these types of responsibilities because they don't have the people who know this stuff. So by default, the people who are handling it, who know probably less about how to solve the problem, even that there is a problem, are letting it linger on. So my prediction is the industry will mature, will solve the problems, and get to what I thought was very important in the beginning, which is a seamless, integrated, real-time capability, which clearly today doesn't exist.
Well, I hope you're right. That'd be pretty cool. Thanks for that, Bill. Scott, what are your thoughts in terms of what problems would you like to see solved, and then maybe a bit of a prediction? You don't need to answer both, but what's on your mind in terms of where we go from here?
And we just continue on the earlier theme. I think I think we're going to continue to see in emerging markets a transition more towards science-based medicine in some of these very large populations. I think there's going to continue to be cost pressure in Europe and the US as drugs are just completely unaffordable. And my thought is, and that's one reason I'm working for BeiGene, is that if we can accelerate clinical trials, make them faster, we can make drugs cheaper, and we can sell them more of a low-cost, high-volume model, like you see in a lot of other industries. Whereas right now it's very niche, very wealthy nations have access, and it's very expensive because you're only selling to 20% of the world's population. So, you know, as I've gone throughout my career, my mom's a cancer survivor, and you know, one of the drugs that she took was one that I'd planned, and I knew some of the sort of inefficiencies that existed. I'm not going to get myself into trouble, but you know, for me, it was. I'm extremely grateful, you know, that she was able to take the medicine, and but there's so many people that couldn't, and you know, I think companies a lot of times make decisions where it's a little lazy. They just focus on, you know, if we could sell it cheaper, we could manufacture it cheaper, we could sell it cheaper, but then it's going to go through the gray market and get back into our French sales, and so, you know, we're not going to do it. And to me, that's morally wrong. So that's what we're about at BeiGene, is we want to make drugs accessible to billions more people. So that's my hope, is that the industry moves along that way as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Emily?
Sure. It's almost like a wish list, like what do
Yeah.
I want? And I was thinking about that actually ever since the first panel with the whole IRT discussion as well. Because from my perspective, obviously the gene therapies, those are like ultra low products, and kind of similar to what Bill said, and it would be great if there was just one source of truth for everything, like an IRT system that will randomize, will maintain your blind, will be your real true source of accountability, also hold all of my temperature data and all the dispositions if there were ever any excursions. But the pessimist in me says we're a long way from there, and I don't know how that could ever happen, but that would be my, you know, my wish. What I think is logical and that I see as attainable, and I think I mentioned it in my earlier answer, is just it's really building partnerships. And kind of the theme of this panel is like, what is the lessons learned? Because a lot of this is tribal knowledge, especially with people who stay at one company, like they know what happened in the past, they know, and they can help guide. And you know, in a perfect situation, right, they go on to other companies and kind of share their wealth that way. But I think lessons learned, and obviously being a partner with your internal stakeholders, mainly for a supply chain professional, obviously that's clinical operations, and educating them. Look, this is what we need from a supply perspective. This is our requirements. Let's kind of work together. And I think I also mentioned one of the key things that from a cold chain perspective is obviously your partners in logistics. And I think Bill called it out, like Unitrans is a perfect example. And I told Anthony I would give you a shout out, so I'm doing it now. And I'm making jokes, but it's totally without their real knowledge of how to handle product, how to maintain not only the chain of custody, but the chain of integrity of our products in all the countries that we went to, our trials wouldn't be successful. And I think that's the key difference, because they are handling our products door to door and not just leaving it, you know, as Bill kind of described, at a loading dock waiting for somebody to receive it, right? It's actual white glove service. And I just can't stress that enough, because and I think Scott said it too, it's that last mile that nobody thinks about. They say, hey, it's not rocket science, guys. You just get this stuff there. Why can't you just do it? But it's the explanation of, well, this is why we can't just change at the drop of a dime, or if you wanted to add another country, it's like explaining, well, I gotta add another label, I gotta do another pack job or whatever. And I think in current times, especially with gene therapy trials, I think, once again, Dr. Person that you mentioned, it's even harder for us to enroll patients, because now, for gene therapy trials, not only do they have to be AAV5 negative to receive the product, if they're going to be on vaccines, what does that mean for them, right? How is that going to interact with the product? And so now it's kind of bringing that into the way we design clinical trials and what the future of gene therapy is as well, because it's already still enrolling. We can't just pivot at the drop of the dime because these drugs are so expensive to make, but the wish list is that hopefully we can one day.
Thank you all. I think what we just heard was probably about a half hour without any talk of technology. It was really about logistics and doing the job, as well as we heard predictions that were pretty optimistic, hopeful for what the future could hold. So thank you all very much. At this point, I wanted to open it up for questions. I'm hopeful that there's some specifics out there that you would want to ask any of the panelists, be it something that's a specific challenge or if you're just interested in their insights. Devendra.
Scott has a question for you.
Okay, and we're way over, so in the interest of speaking for the people, I'll keep it short.
BeiGene is not Genentech or Amgen in terms of size a bit.
Correct.
But you have such a large supply chain that's global. How have you justified the ROI on that kind of an infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think part of our strategy is being sort of at the nexus between the East and the West, right? So there's companies in China that partner with us because we have a good global reach. And there's global companies that partner with us because we have a good access to China. And as we look at what we've already had success with in the pipeline, we're confident the revenue is going to be there, and we're not going to be able to get there without a large infrastructure. I mean, we're investing in massive amount of production capacity. I guess betting on ourselves, and we've delivered 10 drugs to clinic in the last 10 years, and that's accelerating. And we've just upped our R&D fourfold, and we went from 200 to 800 bench scientists. So there's a lot of appetite for investment right now in biotech as well. I mean, there's breakthroughs that people are seeing, and there's willing investors. And our last round of fundraising, broke a lot of records in terms of the amount of funds that we were able to pull together. So our CEO comes from an IT sort of tech background, and it's more of a, when we look at our portfolio, when I first joined the company, I was like, well, we can't fund all of this. We're like, it's going to take $80 million. And like 2 weeks later, he went out and raised $80 million. Because his thought is more of the business school. Like I got my master's at Harvard, and everything was all about, if you can put the investment in and you can make a large return, you pursue it, right? And so that's his approach. And so we're investing, and we're confident we're going to see the returns. So it's exciting times, and we keep getting a lot of commercial approvals, so that helps. We've got to keep the lights on.
Thank you.
Another question? I'll just wait a few seconds here. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you so much, all three panelists.